we're joined now by James Elder, who is a spokesperson for Unicef, that's the UN Children's Agency, who joins us now from Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us. That strike on Rafah killed several Palestinian women and children, and there's now been, nearly 8 months of this kind of deadly violence in Gaza. Just tell us, what has been the impact of this war specifically on children?
Tom, unprecedented from every single way you can look at it. If you look at the trauma of these children, the children in those tents or the children nearby those tents, I know Rafah very, very well. Those children have lost a home. Many of them have lost a loved one. So they've moved multiple times. They've seen a family member killed, maybe their mum, maybe their sister. They are living on one meal a day. They've been doing this for 7 months. That's that level of trauma on a child. The ability to even begin to recover from that will take so much work. It's not going to start right now in a war zone. That's psychologically, physically, malnutrition has never been higher. And right now we are looking at starvation in the eye because the Rafah crossing, the lifeline to aid for coming into Gaza, has been closed. Then, of course, more than 14,000 children reportedly killed. Apparently this number doesn't really resonate. I don't know what number does, but overnight again we've seen that added to. What's hardest, I think, for people to understand, Tom, is that tomorrow and the next day will be worse. Every day that this continues, as people's coping capacity is smashed, as children are in uncharted territory psychologically, as doctors are devastated, and the war continues, it just keeps getting worse until someone with power on both sides and those governments who have the influence call for and abide by a ceasefire.
Sure, and I mean, we've been talking about a full-blown famine as being a major threat to the whole of Gaza for quite some time now. And just to be clear, and this is really for the benefit of our viewers, children are much more vulnerable, aren't they, to malnutrition than adults. Why is that? They're more,
we always say that children are most vulnerable in war, and they simply are across the board. Physiologically, they have a weaker constitution than adults. They are unable to deal with a lack of nutrients for a longer period of time as adults will. In fact, we know that when a child is severely malnourished, they are 10 times more likely to die from the most basic cold, pneumonia, whatever, than a healthy child. So that's the situation of children, and we have seen spikes, particularly in the north where there is imminent famine, unlike Gaza's ever seen before. When I went on missions in the north to get emergency food, Tom, to those people, to watching mothers in tears over cots, over children who were skeletal, we were talking to medical staff who didn't really have training on how to deal with malnutrition because it hasn't been something that existed in Gaza. So you've got malnutrition, you've got disease, all the things we warned of, safe zones. I mean, this dangerous narrative, the idea of a safe zone is legally and ethically safe when it has food, water and medicine to survive. These safe zones have none of those things and they get bombed. So this is the environment that children are trying to survive in. But as we saw from last night, in the most lethal inferno, Gaza remains an absolute hell on earth for boys and girls and their families.
Yeah, and as we heard in that report, literally nowhere for them to run and hide, no protection apart from the canvas or tarpaulin above their heads in their tents. Now, you've previously said, and I want to quote you here, parties to this conflict continue to utterly disregard the lives and protection of children and civilians. And clearly, the losses of lives are continuing. Just tell us, picking up on these obligations you talk about, who is supposed to be doing what to make sure that innocent lives are protected?
Well, firstly, the burden of responsibility falls on Israel as the occupying power. So legally, as the occupying power, they have to ensure a couple of things. One is, in fact, the provision of aid. Now, we're not calling for that. The provision of aid is being done by the United Nations and a whole array of agencies, but they have to allow the safe facilitation of that aid. We've seen massacres, we've seen aid workers killed, we've seen hundreds of UNRWA colleagues killed. So that is their responsibility. And when it comes to a ceasefire, it's both parties. It's both parties to sit down and to understand the enormity of what is happening to children. The idea that city after city has been devastated. The idea that there's not a single university functioning anymore, that half a dozen hospitals are partially functioning and another 30 or 40 aren't operating at all. That is up to both of these warring parties to sit down. Now, I'm not privy to what happens in those negotiations, accusations, but I think it's fair to say that apart from Palestinian, families and their commitment to their children, the way I've seen families take in others, 5, 6 families in one house, break bread with another family, their commitment to each other is unprecedented and so generous. It doesn't seem like anyone else, either of these warring parties, have a great deal of concern for the civilians of Gaza.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been talking about, some of the horrors that these young children have been facing. And quite often when we talk to UNICEF, we're talking about education projects around the world. But there in Gaza, as things stand right now, I mean, it's been 8 months, hasn't it, nearly, of absolutely zero access to education, I'm assuming, for the majority of children in the territory. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely nothing. It's an antithesis, and it's an interesting question too, because as any demographer will tell you, when you have a very young population, and 1 in 2 of Gaza's population are children, if you get it right with the right schools and the right job opportunities, you have a demographic dividend. It's a boom. It's the envy of some aging nations. You can't possibly imagine getting it more wrong right now in terms of we are in uncharted territory when it comes to the trauma of children. Yes, there is no access to education. I see children, Tom, in those tents, just like were burnt down last night, who have had amputations, who need to be in hospital both for their physical wounds, but also psychologically. And they are nowhere near that. Gaza right now is not a place for children. Somehow they're trying to create their own coping capacity. There are many images I won't forget. I will never forget the smell of children's burning flesh on a bus, or a little 9-year-old boy, Omar, whose both his parents were killed. That is now a terrifyingly normal situation in Gaza, a whole family to be killed. Both his parents were killed. His 9-year-old twin was killed. And when Omar and I spoke, for long periods, Tom, he just kept closing his eyes. And I asked his auntie why, and she simply said, he's terrified of losing the image of his parents. He knows he's lost them on earth. He doesn't want to lose them in his mind. You've got children like Omar, 9-year-olds, who are trying somehow to create their own coping capacities in this ongoing hell.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, absolutely horrific, and what heartbreaking testimony. And clearly for Israel, just looking later on down the line, having a neighboring territory like Gaza, let's say in 1 generation from now, with all those children who will have by then grown up, traumatized throughout their childhood, their adolescence, and their early adult life. I mean, it's going to be a country with a huge war wound for very many years to come, even if the fighting stopped tomorrow.
Spot on. And unfortunately, the one thing UNICEF has learned when it comes to trauma and psychological scarring of children is the longer it goes on and the more intense it is, the longer it takes to recover. And that has a social impact, that has an economic impact. And of course, there's no healing in Gaza right now. These children have lost homes. They've watched they've seen family members. They've seen their parents. As I've spoken to the slightly older children, 10, 11, 12, they've seen their parents and they've understood my mum can no longer keep me safe. And they've seen that look in their parents' eyes. So there is a scarring there, but it's ongoing. So these children who've, I spoke to a friend the other day who I met in Gaza, and she spoke about her father's absolute devastation. And he's barely spoken because in the last week, because the family home in Rafah that they'd saved over decades, like everyone around the world, had been destroyed. Now, all those children from that home who are now living in a tent are dealing with not only the nightmare of that their home's been destroyed, but watching their parents. The parents are the front line. Yes, organisations like UNICEF are on those front lines doing all we can, but it's mums and dads who are there 24 hours a day. And those mums and dads are enduring the same horrors that children are. So they have lost that ability to provide the kind of care that they want to.
Okay, well, I'm being told we're out of time, but I'd love to keep the conversation going. Thank you very much, meanwhile. James Elder, spokesperson for the UN Children's Agency, UNICEF. Thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us.
Thanks, Tom.